Look, thank you, Gabe, and thank you, John, for those very kind words. I did want to start with thanking a lot of people. It's been a huge privilege to be here as part of the Thinkers programme. It is one of the things that makes South Australia distinctive, not just in Australia, but actually globally. A state that wants to look to find the best minds to come to engage with its concerns, and a government that actually is willing to say openly what everybody actually knows, which is that government doesn't have all the best ideas. But very few people have the courage to go through with that notion. And this is a programme which I always encourage premiers and prime ministers in other jurisdictions and in other countries internationally to look at and to seriously consider adopting. So it's been I've had a great time here. I'd obviously like to thank all the partners who've put so much into the residency. It is one of the characteristics of this programme that you're not just on your own, you're supported by partners who enter into a real intellectual partnership with you, and it's a real form of sustenance across the residency. I don't want to identify particular agencies, but I've had a really strong support from the chief executives and the ministers in health and in education, and also from the chief executive in the Department of Premier and Cabinet. My team, who've worked with me, Kyra and Lynn and Joe, have given me better support probably than I deserve, and certainly some of the best support I've received in any position I've worked in the world. So this is a moment to say, if anything goes wrong with this, it is their fault, right? I'm not really into a blame culture, but occasionally it's satisfying. I was shown great hospitality when I've been here. I was taken out into, I've been taken on lots of trips to try to get to understand South Australia. You really don't, I think, understand a place unless you go to the kind of furthest extent. I've been out to Whyalla, I've been to Port Augusta. I've seen how health perform in a country setting as well as an urban setting, and for that I have to thank Helen Chalmers, who's probably my choice for the person to go on a road trip with if I ever had to go on another road trip. And I've had a really strong support from colleagues within the Department of Premier and Cabinet working on the issues. I think there's a real openness here to inquiry, and I hope that I've responded well to the questions people asked, that I've listened hard to what people have said, and that in the end people will see reflected back in my lecture, my recommendations and my report, an honest analysis and an honest account of where you are and where you can get to. Because I've said it often to the Cabinet here, South Australia is poised for greatness. It just needs to take the next step. So before I kick off with my actual lecture, I want to show a short video. This is a video of a teacher. It's one of a series of videos, webisodes, that are going to be available on the website of the Education and Child Development Department. And if you just want to show this now. It's a bit long, but I showed you it because every time I see that, I just want to give her a big hug and say, you're doing what we expect all public servants to do. That is excellent. The great thing is it's right through the system. There's actually a whole load of other stories I could have shown, but that one, in a way, I think that you feel the character, the personality coming across. And I suppose the question that comes to mind when you see that is, why aren't all public servants like that? Why isn't every encounter with state services like that? And listen, I think this is part of the answer. I just saw this at the weekend. You have to ask yourself, like Keith, this is really for Keith. Keith Bartley, who runs Education and Child Development, has been collecting signs which demonstrate that Australia is not actually a kind of rumbustious Crocodile Dundee culture. It's a very, very cautious, safety-obsessed one. And his favourite is the one down on the beach where a sign is plonked in the middle of a whole bunch of rocks saying, "Caution, rocks buried in sand." But I do think this does actually get to the heart of something. That's actually in the disabled toilet as well. So what was the problem that occurred that made them worried that people were drinking? Generally, because if there had ever been a story in Australia, I'm sure we'd have known. And what this is about the risk culture. It's about managing risk. And it's actually about the sign, if you run an airport, risk is really, really important. There's huge risks involved in flying planes. There's massive apparatus to not just investigate accidents, but to investigate near misses. One of the biggest advances in air safety is when they realized if you get pilots to report near misses, you can investigate the underlying problems in systems. And as long as if you say you're not going to be punished for reporting a near miss, if you have a no blame culture, then you can actually investigate risk. Airports have got a lot of risk management in them. There's clearly somebody who's got to the end of reasonable risk management and thought, where are the other risks? And is going through trying to find risks. And this is it's not the only example I found in South Australia, but it's probably the funniest. And look, there are good reasons, not just in hospitals, but in other services for risk. I remember when Tony Blair talked about how he really wanted public servants to be kind of more risk averse. And I thought, I really, really don't want that in child protection, for example. You do want people to manage risk in child protection. And in surgery, you do want surgeons and the team to count the number of instruments on the side before they start the operation and count them at the end. Because all the international evidence says that if you count instruments before and after an operation, fewer instruments get left sewn up inside patients. Now, it seems odd, you have to tell surgeons not to sew things up inside, but it's one of those things, you do need to manage risk in certain circumstances. But risk becomes a barrier to change. It becomes the reason we can't change. And I've had a lot of conversations where, in effect, people say, it'd be great to change, but what if we failed? That would be terrible if we failed. And then we'd got beaten up by ministers, we'd get beaten up in the press, we'd get beaten up by the public, there'd be a big beat up somewhere. To which my response is quite often, well, you clearly don't mind failure, because there's failure in the current system. You're just happy with the failure you've got. You're really unhappy about measuring the cost of the current failure and measuring the cost of not doing the things that you would be able to do if you released resources by doing things properly. Because that's the thing, that's the other thing about failure. It's much more expensive to do things badly than it is to do things well. It's a fundamental rule that you find it when investigating avoidable deaths in hospitals. The US Health Department has been doing it for 20 years, and almost invariably accidents are caused by a multiplicity of causes. They're not a single cause. And when you take apart a chain, you then put it back together again, and you make the system better, more robust, better quality, and it's cheaper as well. So money isn't really the issue. It's a view about risk, and this kind of sums it up. Because risk becomes the shield behind which you hide. When actually all I've been talking to in almost every encounter I've had with people, and all the best stories I get back from people, are about the importance of incremental change. Now actually the South Australian Public Service has got reams and reams of stuff written about its ethics and how it works and what its values are. And buried inside them, there's a line that says, commitment to continuously improving the quality of the services that we provide. Now, that would be really, really lovely. It would actually be quite dangerous if people actually believed the words and actually did the thing that they say there. I've heard enough stories from different departments about the internal bureaucracy that ties you up in chains, that wraps you up. The precise way you have to present a memorandum if it's going to go up to a chief executive or to a minister. The way things are sent back to you, the way there's a culture. I'm sorry if this is kind of excluding people who come here from the public. There's a culture of excessive briefing, asking for more and more information about an issue before deciding on it, as if more and more information will make it easier to make a decision, because decisions are not driven primarily by information. They're driven by a combination of values, intuition, emotion, and rationality. More and more information doesn't make it easier. More and more information can make it easier for me to say, you all gave me that information, you are now complicit in my decision. But it's an evasion of responsibility and accountability. And this is life inside a state bureaucracy. That's a sculpture. I saw that sculpture in Sydney. It was on the Sculptures by the Sea. It's called the Bureaucratic Tank. If you look really, really carefully, it's made up of filing cabinets. And the artist who designed it says, there's a caption that goes with it. It says, the bureaucratic tank, made up of filing cabinets, it crushes human beings and leaves a trail of paper behind it. It's a gorgeous thing. And I suppose that one of the things I am interested in seeing is could the South Australian public service move away from a culture of compliance? Because that, in effect, is what there is. What does risk management take you to if it's done badly? It takes you to ticking off a bunch of things. And the issue that people care about is not whether you manage the risk for the client or the customer. You're managing the risk to yourself or the bureaucracy. And in the end, it's a self-preserving thing. Because I don't think anybody ever got into trouble by doing things by the book, but not getting the right outcome. They get into trouble for innovating and for reaching out and doing something to somebody, but without having permission, not doing it by the book. And I think that is if you want innovation and entrepreneurship within public service, then you have to make a lead. There's a thing, and I've quoted it often, and I quote it often because it's really worth quoting, which is Tom Peters, the American management guru, he always says to leaders, chief executives, everybody who works for you is dynamic, creative, energetic, entrepreneurial, except for the 8 hours a day they come to work for you. And people always laugh with a laugh of recognition because they think, yeah, systems drive out of you the desire to change things. You just live with them. There's too many stories. I don't want to name. It's not about naming and shaming. This is about making a proposition. And my proposition is, government should aim to reduce the red tape internally with as much vigor as it reduces the red tape, the burden on business and the burden on the client and the consumer. So if you did that, if you ended up in a world where there's an office somewhere in South Australia where if you send a letter for signature and it's not got 6 carriage returns between yours sincerely and the name of the person, it gets returned to you until you put the extra carriage returns in. Clearly the person who opened that Word file doesn't know how to edit Word. Clearly the person who sent it back has no sense of proportion either. So I think, if we had targets for reducing internal red tape, I think actually maybe the Premier, I've been reading what Jay Weatherall's been saying in his press club speech and his public statements. I think if he made an appeal to the public service and said, please send in to me examples of unnecessary bureaucratic regulation, unnecessary disproportionate regimes for managing risk, a whole flood of ideas would come up. And if you implemented them, a whole amount of work could be reduced. It's hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people days every month are tied up in that. And what a signal that would send. What a signal it would send about the desire of this the state government to release the energies that are tapped inside it. It's not the only thing, really, it's not the only thing that's holding things back. But look, in my view, what there is a culture, and it's not unique to South Australia, but there's a culture in the public service which in a sense constantly reinforces looking after the system, not looking after the public. There's loads of good examples of where that's been broken through. Service SA, the shift to online has been massive. I think online is now the major way in which people in South Australia access government information. And the shift not just to online, to web, but also to smartphones. What the figures are, 40% of Australians currently have smartphones. In the next 5 years, it'll be 2/3. So increasingly, the way you engage with government has to be versioned to smartphones and has to have an app. And there's an app for your rego, and that is now, I think smartphones are now 40% of all the traffic. And it's just, these things make sense and they cost less. The brilliance is people want to use the new forms of access, and they're cheaper, and when you adopt them, you can redesign services and make them better. So really, my final report's not going to be about a litany of stories about what's going wrong, or a litany of or a kind of a catalogue of stories of what's going right. I could do that. I want to get into the guts of how do you change organizational culture. And I think the answer is you have to focus on purpose. And I like this quote because it sets a very testing benchmark. Great political parties exist for great public purposes. Great organizations exist for great public purposes. And when you think, and I've been discussing this with various people, when you think that Coca-Cola convinced their staff all around the world that marketing and selling type 2 diabetes to people is a great public purpose. And then think about government, which actually does have great public purposes in education, in care for older people, in healthcare more generally, in road safety, and go through it in public housing, in families and children, in communities, in disability care. Everywhere you go in government, you've got great public purposes, but I'm not sure those purposes are driven through the organization as the point of their existence, as the reason people are working. I come across somebody who was talking about her best experience of working in government, and she said it was when she joined the public service, about 20 years ago, 25 years ago. That when you worked in the Department of Veterans Affairs, you knew what you were working for. You were working on behalf of the veterans. Isn't that great? To know what you're working for, and everything else kind of falls to one side. The stuff that gets in your way, if it gets between you and your object. So really I'm arguing that we should have an examination inside departments. You ask, what's the purpose? Who are we here for? What are we here for? Because the education department doesn't exist so that there can be a chief executive. The health department doesn't exist so it can fund hospitals. All of these exist for the people at the very bottom of the chain. That's why when he was education minister, Jay Weatherall wanted to have a school or an educational facility actually on the ground floor of the education HQ building, so that every day when you go in, you can see who you're working for. You're working for those little people. And that sense of who are we working for, that sense of purpose, I think is the first thing that we should be driving through. And that's a question people should always ask them when they have a difficult issue at work, or they've got an easy issue at work. Who are we here for? And quite often you'll find out the thing we're doing is not for the people we think we're here for. This was the second question around purpose, which is important, is the question of values. And values are really important. And in healthcare, people will tell you the values are clear, the Hippocratic Oath, and the Hippocratic Oath has a really important part in it. They say, first, do no harm. Well, that's a powerful, powerful thought. And if, in lots of parts of life, if you thought, first, do no harm, you'd probably do a lot better in your life than most of us do. Because it is a really, really powerful injunction. Certainly when I used to do policy work, if I'd ever thought of that, I'd probably been a better policy developer. But values, I mean, there's broader values. There's public service values. There are political values. Margaret Thatcher, when she was Prime Minister of the UK, had a policy unit whose first question to any policy was, is there a more market-oriented way of doing this? It's a brilliant question. If you are wanting to strip out the involvement of government in loads of areas, asking, is there a more market-oriented way of doing it? You can ask, is there a way of doing this which delivers more social justice? The values of the government, the political values, the philosophical values, as well as the professional values, need to come together. And the question I've asked lots of chief executives when I've been here is, do you think that the lowest graded members of staff in your organization know what the point is? If you went and asked a receptionist you ask a receptionist in a government office, or you ask a porter in a hospital, can they tell you what the purpose of the organization is? And really big, really good, powerful private sector organizations do it really well. There's I think it was DHL, was a friend of mine went to work at DHL on secondment, the big logistics company. And she was kind of, she's very cynical about the Americanized values, the customer first, all this stuff. But she realized there was a powerful culture at work there. And she noticed they had the values up everywhere, very brash American, blah, blah. But they were just stuck on the wall, and over time they were getting tattered and things. And she said, so what's going on here about your values? I thought you cared about them. And they said, look, we live our values, we don't laminate them. And that was a message that was right through the organization. They kind of knew what they were up. So my first batch of recommendations are for government. I've touched on this before. I think that there should be a target of cutting internal red tape. I think there's a case for saying that if you took a comprehensive approach to e-government, that if you turbocharged the service SA model, if you really examined the possibilities of using other channels for delivering government services, you could, across the board, make a really big transformation. And this last point is really important, because I think quite a few of the things I'm going to touch on are, for me, about the 21st century, it being a different century from the one we lived in before. John Hill talked about the huge advance in lifespan, and also the match between the life expectancy increasing, but also retirement age lowering. And that's a consequence of Australian living standards have at least quadrupled since 1950. The figure that stuns me and scares me coming from the UK is that 20 years ago, Australian GDP was a third of British GDP, and today it's half of British GDP. And in 20 years, it'll be 2/3 of British GDP. And that's not been driven by population growth. So this is a country that's getting older and getting richer. And I'll come back to this when I talk about health and the language around health. But cut internal red tape, develop a real comprehensive e-government strategy, develop 21st century leaders. And what do 21st century leaders actually need? Well, one thing is they've got to get beyond the great man and great woman theory of history. One person doesn't change an organization. Leadership is distributed. Leaders can make a cultural difference, and you can see that when a chief executive changes, when suddenly a new mood and a new way of working is allowed. But that's partly because their model of leadership is one of distributed leadership. I model the leadership that I want others to model themselves, but that goes through my organization. So partly it's about that, partly as I think about modern communication skills. I don't think you can be a modern leader and not be able to engage not just with the print media or the TV and the radio, the old-fashioned media, but actually to engage with a suite of media you can actually use, the channels you can now use. And there's a whole number of other capacities, and I think that one of the key ones is that cross-government, the government should take a view about the capabilities, the abilities, the capacities that are needed in leadership. And to be clear, in my view, there should be more women leaders throughout the public service. There should be more women leaders everywhere. It's we're still working our way through getting equal access for women to leadership. But they need to work out what those are and then have a comprehensive program that means that the police and the teachers and the social workers, and there's a comprehensive approach across the board, so the leadership capacity is the same in all the departments, but has a flexibility in it to adapt. And I think an adaptive form of leadership is important too. Now, looking more at central government, these apply to I've looked at other departments, these apply to the departments as well. I suppose my worry, and I know it's described here as decide and defend in terms of policy. My worry about policy is that we quite often assume that we have a common understanding of what a problem is when we analyse something, and I'm not sure that's always true. So you need to make sure we know what the problem is. I think we need to be quite, and this in some senses overlaps into the world of community engagement and how we discuss stuff with the public. There are always, with any given problem, there's almost always more than one way to deal with it. Part of the problem with consultation is you never are quite clear with the public. Are we asking you to just agree to it, consent to this, which is perfectly respectable. It's a change we're doing because we're a Labour government and other governments wouldn't do it, so we're explaining it to you, but it's to get your consent in terms of us selling it to you. We're asking you to engage with it and challenge it and say there's another way of doing this. And part of the problem with them again, to go back to the modern world, this is a very highly educated country. If you think of the staying on rates at school, compare them to the 1950s. Think of the level of qualification at TAFE compared to the 1950s. Think of the number of people who get degrees compared to the 1950s. Then add in the fact that everybody in Australia has got 2 personal researchers, Google and Wikipedia. You've got a very well-informed public. So are you asking them to engage with offering new solutions, new ways of doing it? And so with policy, you've got to be clear. This is the problem. These are the facts. This is the way we're going to analyse it, and this is what we're going to do. And then come back to the culture of compliance. evaluate properly what you're doing. Hundreds of millions of dollars are spent on policies. It's not small money. Actually, even more money is spent on things which aren't the result of policies, which just are the way we do things around here. But evaluate what we're doing, and then actually assess whether we're achieving with the policy we started on what we set out to solve. Very often, evaluation isn't evaluation, it's monitoring. And monitoring is a form of discipline. And the discipline is, are you doing what I've told you to do? Because that's the underlying culture. Not are we doing what we're are we solving what we're trying to solve? Are you doing what I told you to do? Is the implicit thing. And then my other obsession here is with communications. Again, communication is often thought to be dead simple, right? You've done something, just ask the press officer to deal with it now, publicize it. Anybody who's ever tackled a difficult problem understands that you need to communicate, you need to understand where other people are. Go back to this point that Gabe was saying about listening. You know, the key thing that government needs to understand is that a conversation isn't just waiting for your turn to speak. And government is very good at one-way communication. And the internet is a brilliant thing for people who think, now I've got cheap one-way conversation. I don't even need to publish a report. I'll just bash it up as a PDF and stick it on the website. Now, the thing about the internet is it is there for two-way communication. People expect a return path. People expect you to return a response to their response. It sounds, on the face of it, like it's more bureaucratic and more taxing and it requires more staff. But in the end, a proper conversation, a proper discussion about handling an issue, about a policy, ends up with a deeper rooted public support for it. Because one of the paradoxes of public administration is that people love public service. Most people, most of the time, love public services. And how do I know that? Because the evidence is whenever you try and close one down, they go bonkers. And it turns out a community who you'd written off as passive have got web designers, they've got PR guys, they've got press contacts, they can do great stand-up grabs to camera. As I said, entrepreneurial, driven, talented, etc., etc. And what government doesn't do very well is tap into that energy and that emotion and that passion, that conviction, that pride, except when we try to change things. So communications is actually trying to tap into an existing energy. So really, again, it's really simple, but I think a lot of this is simple. Ronald Reagan once said, it's not easy, but it is simple. And it's a good description of some of the issues facing government. So what are we saying? Who are we saying it to? And where are we saying it? What channels are we using it? You know, we're on ABC News 24, fantastic. Last time I was in Canberra, I did an interview on Sky. And loads of people said to me, oh, I saw you were on Sky. I said, yeah, what do you think? And they said, oh, I don't know. I don't know what you said. We had the sound down in the office, but the pictures were on. And so that was me failing to get a message across to people who actually were watching Sky, let alone most people who don't. So the question is, what channels are people watching? The other thing which I think isn't done often enough, and I think there's huge opportunities nowadays, did we get our message across? Did we hit the mark? Did people get what we're trying to say? Did they move from where they were to where we wanted to get them to? Because one of the great things about social media, I start with the bad thing. One of the bad things about social media is people can talk about you. They can gossip about you, can chatter about you, they can be horrible about you. The great thing is you can find it out. Now, on a personal level, that's quite good. And if you've got a name like mine, McTernan, you can easily search how much has been said about you on Twitter, right? For a government, it should be huge advantage to follow what's the chat going on in South Australia about government, central, local. That can be mapped, it can be tracked, it can be evaluated. In the UK, the Ministry of Defence analysed email traffic, internet traffic, and found out that one of the big sources that squaddies, the basic troops, got information from was a thing called the British Army Rumours Service, always shortened to ARSE. And so there's now a press officer whose job is to read what's going on this rumours service, and then go in and write a thing saying MOD, and this is what's actually happening. That's true, that's not true. it becomes a dialogue. Now, if you don't get involved in the new channels, the new communications, be absolutely clear about this. If you're not making a reputation for yourself, somebody else is making a reputation for you. And so communications is incredibly important. I suppose to sum up what I want people in public service to think about is to always ask yourself the question, who is this for? And then ask, can we make it better? And those two as motors are the beginning of setting a culture which has got a virtuous circle of working for the public interest. Now, I did go to health and education settings. I just wanted to give some reality to what Gabe was just saying. I've not just spoken to 1,400 people, 1,500 people, I've listened to them, and there's a bunch of voices here which I just wanted to let you hear.
One of the most popular programs in the school has been the Stephanie Alexander Kitchen Garden. On a Thursday we run our cooking program, and that entails having about 20 different parents and grandparents coming to help the students in the kitchen. So we have grandparents, we have neighbours, we have whoever will come in and help us. They feel more comfortable in a kitchen than sometimes they would hearing a child read or help them with their maths, but they're quite happy to be in the kitchen doing that.
What we're trying to do is get schools to think, I guess, beyond the school fence and sort of say that there's expertise, resources and support outside that school fence. The parents in a school community are also our connection to industry and business, are also people that have resources in education, in learning. It's utilising and harnessing all those resources.
We've got health advisory councils that surround our services, and they're often made up with really committed people from our local communities. They determined the plans and said what their local priorities for health services were, and they did an amazing job of it. They talked in some cases to 70 or 80 different groups and parts of the communities. They did surveys, they stood in shopping centres, they went to service clubs, they talked to school groups, and they said, what do you want your health services to be? And as they did that, they developed plans that had their sign-off to go to the minister.
All we kept hearing were the rumours, the school will never open, school's not going to be built, it's just, it's going to be a mess. And so we started a Facebook page. And the first people who liked us, we got very excited when we got to 5 people who weren't us that liked the Facebook page. And then it got to 10, and then it got to 20. But not only the families, the kids liked it as well. I think if we took it away now, the entire community would be in revolt. The thing I really love about the development has been in opening up the classroom.
Usually you have to make an appointment to go and see a children's centre or a kindy or something like that. Not this kindy, you can just walk in and they're all just so loving, like, yeah, you can come anytime, and not anytime with the kids, but
Well, I think because the type of nursing that I love to do is, really patient care, and I love just being able to sit down and chat with them and educate them on, why they're here and what they need to do for their care.
We believe strongly that patients should be looked after, like how we look after our loved one, our mom and dad, our spouse, our family. The care must disseminate all throughout. I mean, not just Queen Elizabeth Hospital, the state, the country health, but of course all throughout.
Once people understand the needs of a patient, most clinicians and managers of a hospital do recognise at their core that they're actually there for the patient. And if we make the focus about what's best for the patient and we can supply evidence to support that, that to my mind is the way you start change.
If we were able to understand what it is that's important to people, and if we were better at systematically providing it, or systematically engaging people in that conversation about what's important to you and what have we got to do to make sure you get it, we could nip a lot of complaints in the bud. The most timely and cost-effective way, with the highest level of satisfaction by both the people seeking the services and the people providing the services, are where we can create a partnership. And creating a partnership, as in any other part of life, is the way to get the optimum result.
I mean, the first thing in almost every equation that we hear of is give me more money and I'll fix the problems. We know through experience that that's not the case. Money will go so far, but then you need to harness the resources of the community.
That's just a tiny, tiny fraction of the people that I met, and I think you probably got a sense there of how open they were, of how honest they were, of how interesting they were. I think it's one of the great... I've never really had a job like this, where basically, when you meet people for the first time, they're as honest with you as people normally are after the 10th time they meet with you. You know, the title, the responsibility, the response to the office is such that you get very quickly to an open and honest conversation, and that is great, and that's been one of the things which enables, I think, this program to work so quickly on getting to into the heart of an issue. So what, I think you could hear the people there picking up lots and lots of the themes. There's the passion, there's the commitment, and I think as Sasha finished up saying, it's not just about money. It can't just be about money. Partly because we'd never have enough money, but also because if you go to the heart of some of these things, we must be careful about monetizing everything and turning everything that we want into simply an exchange of money. So much caring in the health system, whether it's healthcare or it's caring for older relatives or younger relatives, it's done for free. And I always get a bit nervous when I see calculations saying hundreds of millions of dollars or billions of dollars are being saved for the state by people providing informal care. They're not being saved to the state. Hundreds of millions, hundreds of thousands of ordinary people are being loving children or loving parents or good neighbors or nieces or nephews or uncles or aunts. They're being what we are. They're being human beings. And that's really important for us not to take that out of the system by monetizing it, by always turning it into a dollar sign, by always saying, why can't the state do this? Well, there's a good reason why the state doesn't do it. Because people, families, communities look after each other with a great deal of compassion. And the trick is, as Sasha said, and Linda Oliphant said at the beginning, it's how do you get people engaged? So Linda Oliphant says if parents and grandparents don't want to be there reading to a child, but they can be in the kitchen. You learn loads in the kitchen. You learn science, you learn science in the kitchen. You learn so there's different settings there, all these different voices. And although Kelly, who was up there, didn't say it, she's a mother who's got back into formal education because of the re-engagement through kindy, not by just leaving her kid there, but because the staff want to help you on a journey back into education. So I want to talk about health now. I've spent a lot of time in the health system, and I'm really pleased that John Hill is now both an ageing minister and the ageing minister. Because I think we have to acknowledge that ageing is the issue of this century, there's no doubt about that. And it's the issue of the century for almost everywhere. And when was it? It was the other day, the 7 billionth child was born, named by UNESCO. We will get to 9 billion, but the speed of increase is slowing and it's going to peak. And by 2060, China's going to be an aging society. So this is an issue that's only for the developed West, it's an issue for all of us. And what does it mean? It means a lot of things. It means a different attitude from banks to lending. Because if you only think that young people can be entrepreneurs, you might not lend to an older person. But if you've got a smaller and smaller number of younger people flowing into the economy, does that mean there'll be no small businesses? Do we think people in the 50s aren't going to set up small businesses? Or shouldn't? We've got some big choices about how this society runs itself. Because if we really believe people over 50 shouldn't, can't, or won't set up businesses, then it's going to be a very different kind of private sector in South Australia over time. And not just South Australia, but everywhere else. That's why my kind of top recommendation is starting to address the issue of ageing in all policy. Because if ageing policy is thought to be the responsibility of the Department of Health, ageing becomes what it quite often defaults to, a problem. a deficit model. What a shame about older people. They just lack the things that we have. And if only we could give them something to substitute for that or to mitigate that, it would all be fine. And this has really got to be a thinking through, what is transport policy for older people? Well, what is transport? I quite often do this with, it's really unfair to do this with transport engineers, but I do it anyway. I say to transport engineers, what is the point of a road? And most of them get the first point, which is it's for cars to go on. The smarter ones go, it's for public transport too, isn't it, John? And I go, yeah, roads are there to deliver social justice. Roads are there to deliver social justice because if there were no roads, there'd be no buses. If there were no buses, Granny couldn't go across town to do some childcare for her daughter so her daughter could have a part-time job. Or if the bus doesn't run early in the morning, you can't get to the work, the low-paid work, but it's entry-level work. It's work that one day is the first step on a ladder. It's the ability to put a down payment on a house or a down payment on something else. So aging is in all policies because the intent of creating an age-friendly society, an age-friendly city, which Alexander Kalisher will unpack a bit more in his residency, has to be at the heart of what we do. Secondly, the word I want absolutely banned is burden. The burden of aging, the burden of older people. Genuinely. People who say that I'm a mild-mannered Scot. I'm not Malcolm Tucker from the thick of it. I'm not genuinely somebody who loses their temper. When people talk about the burden of aging, it's just like, in the last century, collectively, we awarded each other 30 extra years of life because of the welfare state, because of Clean Air Acts, because of health and safety at work, because of decent diets, because of prosperity. That's what we chose to give each other collectively. And, Australia should be proud of what it's done for its fellow Australians. So never say burden. I also say, don't use positive language because I'm 52 and it's going to be me soon. So I don't want to be thought of in those terms. There's a thing I used in my first lecture, Sir Kenneth Robinson, a UK educationalist, who talked about primary schools being the only time in your life when your date of manufacture, the year you were born, is the only significant fact about you. You're 5, you go in that class. You're 7, you go in that class. And we all take it for granted. You spend your life living with 7-year-olds and with 8-year-olds. I mean, I can't imagine how bonkers I'd be going if I was living only with 52-year-olds now. Right, we all want to live across spans of ages, and yet, when we get to a certain point, we go into another box called old. And all of us think we're not going to get there. And the best example of that attitude is a story I tell a lot, because it's such a good one, about Joan Collins, and apologies for those who know it. When Joan Collins married, I think, her 4th husband, and there was a 40-year age difference between them, some newspaper reporter said, "Oh, Miss Collins, aren't you worried about the difference in ages?" And she said, "Look, if he dies, he dies." And so we need a bit more positivity, I think, about. So we should celebrate the century of aging, thinking of positive ways of thinking about it. And this third recommendation, this is really the heart of what I've been doing and talking to people in the health service. There's a much longer speech I could give you just about the health stuff, but the point is, the health system exists for the patient, not the patient for the health system. And there are many barriers that get between clinicians and allied professions and support staff in their job of trying to help that person. And there's lots of individual recommendations I want to tease out, like every single person, by and large, most people who go into hospital leave hospital. And yet, by and large, there's not a consistent approach to saying, if you're coming in, how do we start preparing for you to go home? There's issues about the transitions into residential care, aged care, the different regimes you have to be assessed for, and there's lots of bureaucracy that I would hope over time and with goodwill could be eased out. But the core of it is, it's about the patient. I heard a great story, terrible story, but a great story. The story about if you end up, this is not from South Australia, it's about another state who they were worried about the quality of patients' meals. Good thing to be worried about. They decided to focus on measuring the temperature of the meal at the point it was delivered to the patient the minute it gets to your bedside or onto your table. Fair enough. They spent a lot of time getting a monitoring system, and the consequence was that staff ran in, dumped the plate, ran out, and never bothered to check whether the person was sitting in a way they could get to the food. Never went back and checked whether they'd eaten the food, because the point was what gets measured gets done. So the temperature was measured, and they had fantastic graphs on the temperature as delivered. But the purpose of the meal is not the temperature. The purpose of the meal is nutrition. And it is a sad fact that, those of you who've had older relatives in hospital, and those of you who are geriatricians or in allied professions, you'll know a lot of older people become deconditioned in hospital. They lose weight, they lose muscle tone, they don't exercise enough. So for me, in the conversations I've been having in the health service, the thing that's come back to me, people are always saying that they like the focus that we keep making in this residency on the patients, put the patient first. Go back to what I said about the purpose. Who are we here for? We're here for the patient. The reason I asked the question, why do consultants not do rounds on a Saturday and a Sunday? It's clearly not for the patient. It's probably not even for the convenience of the consultant. It's part of the bargaining that's been done on their behalf by unions. But it's not even for the benefit, because it's not for the benefit of the hospital, because on the Monday, there's 2 days' worth of people who could have been discharged back into the community, who've gone back to their homes. So there's questions there about, how do we keep the patient the focus of all that we do? And how do we, and there's a phrase that somebody said, which I think is fantastic in one of our conversations, that a breakthrough in service performance is almost always achieved by a change in behavior. And that's a really important thing to think about. And then it's really important to think about ourselves and think how hard it is to change behavior. How hard it is to diet properly. How hard it is to stick to the limit of the number of units of alcohol you should safely drink each week. How hard it is to do the things that we know affect our lives directly, not other people's lives. Really hard to change behavior. It was easy to change behavior, there'd not be all these behavior change gurus and all these programs, and all these diets and all these supplements. So how do you change behavior in an organization? Luckily, it's a bit easier to change habits in organizations, because if you're built around teams, teams moderate each other's behavior. See, peer group pressure is a powerful positive and a powerful negative, and that's got to be part of the focus of rebuilding services. Education. Again, there's been a change in education since I've been here. The creation of the new Department of Education and Child Development. There's a huge opportunity here. And what is it? At the heart of it is the notion that you can have a continuity between care and education. At the heart of it is a notion that you could give every child the best start in life. Not only give them all the best start in life, you could, as Keith has said, in various occasions, you could try and make sure that no kid is left behind. Because it's not just about the best start, it's about as you go through the system. The Finnish education system, which I love, has at its heart the notion that when you're 6 or 7 or 8 or 9, you shouldn't really be falling behind other kids your age. They don't accept it the way we accept it. And so in any given year in Finland, 20% of children have got special support in education to pull them up in maths or in English or in writing or reading, whatever it is. Now, No Child Left Behind is a powerful, powerful, powerful thing. And if you can build that, you can then get yourself to a notion of opportunity for all in high school and TAFE and higher education. And then really what you can have is a culture of excellence. There's a huge opportunity in this new department. It really excites me. And again, in the heart of it, you've got, I suppose, 2 things I'm going to recommend in detail about. The first one is, look, we've seen it in my videos. You had a couple of head teachers. The head teacher of Mark Oliphant, who, she's a force in nature. She's fantastic. That school is a wonderful school, a birth to year 12 school, a school which was unpopular before it was rebuilt and now is oversubscribed. And there's a 5-minute web-based film about her too. Brilliant. You should watch it on the ECD website. We know that school principals have a massive impact on the quality of schooling. And this is my kind of drilling down to the notion of the importance of 21st century leadership. We do need not just good principals now who are invested in and supported in and developed, but the next generation. And of course, there'll always be people who push themselves forward and do that. But how many people are there out in the system who'd be great leaders if only they were encouraged, if they were asked, if they were pulled, if somebody developed them and mentored them? So I do think investing in the next generation of leaders. But there's not just the voices of teachers, principals. In my videos, there was the voice of parents. And I think the key to unlocking education and educational attainment is working with parents. One of the ways which, to me, works in the schools I've seen is when schools are explicit about what the kids are going to learn over the next term. It's a simple change. It's done by lots of teachers already. It's not uniform. If you can share with the parents and the pupils what they're going to be studying over the next term, the parents and the pupils can invest in the extra work that's needed to pull that up. And it just gives... That is a partnership. And partnership was a word that kept coming through in the voices that I heard in the meetings I went to, but also in the videos I ran. There's loads. I mean, there's lots and lots more detail that one could get into in education. And one thing that crosses education and health is a thing about communication. It's language. There are international standards for analysing how complicated language is to understand. So I went onto the ECD website and I went to the information for parents. And I went to information for parents about how to choose a school. Having done that, I just cut and pasted a section and ran it through one of the online systems for measuring how complicated it is. It said you need to be a graduate to understand this. And that's the information for parents. Now, I'm not picking on it. There's loads and loads of leaflets in hospitals, which I don't think the people that are aimed at could understand them, let alone read them tiny, tiny print. Just not well designed, not thought through. People writing in the language that they can understand for people who can't understand in that way. And so at the heart of what we do is a kind of a complete re-engineering. And it's actually much more fun to write something that people can read, because then they read it. And when they read it, then they actually are informed, and you complete the circle. And it's a sort of, there is a whole lot of job satisfaction to be found in doing things a lot better. So the language is a key issue, I think. And I would also ask, for anybody who's here in health, why do you have anything in a leaflet form anymore? Who does pick up leaflets? I'll tell you, I do, because I pick them up to criticise them. Because that's why I'm a professional moaner and somebody who tries to find good examples for using in lectures like this. But this kind of, have some forms of communication come to their end. So now, look, that's been a brief kind of run through the very high level recommendations I'm going to make. This is the kind of conclusion I've come to about culture. I could have stood and read Bobby Kennedy quotes to you right through the evening. He's one of the great speakers of the last century, one of the great social democrats of the last century, one of the great tragedies. He was assassinated. But that quote there, and I really always try to resist reading in PowerPoint because I know my audiences can read. I hate this PowerPoint presentation. People put a slide up and then they read every word on it as though we're actually infants and don't have the capacity to read. The key thing there is why not? What would it be like if we had a why not approach to public service? There's loads of stories I've heard when I've been here. Here's one. A woman who got on a bus. It was an express bus. She didn't want the express bus. She got on by accident. It does happen. She asked the driver to drop her at the next bus stop. Not at the traffic lights, not in the middle of the road. He said, no, I can't do that, love. He didn't say love, obviously, because he's not from London, but he said no. Or he said no very politely, because I'm sure I think. Now, why did he say no? What trouble was he going to get into for stopping? Were the people on the bus going to go, you've made me 90 seconds later? 45 seconds later. He did it because it's safe to stick inside the rules. There's not a permissive culture. There's not a culture of service. What if he just asked, why not? If every time a public servant thinks they should say no, they ask themselves, why not? Wouldn't things be better? Because I'm not saying people should say yes. Not when someone says, you want to say no, say yes. It's ask why not, which says, what is the reason? What's the underlying reason? Question the reason why I'm saying this. Am I just using this? When I send this letter back to you, say it's not in the right font. Why am I doing that? Seriously. And so a why not culture is probably the slogan that I want to leave people with. But also, I've had lots of other people's stories during this lecture. I want to end with one of my stories. When I was out in Port Augusta, I went out to Waimikata, which is I think next year will be the 60th anniversary of it as a residential facility. It's one of the oldest continuously used residential facilities for Aboriginals. And it's an amazing place. Visiting any aged care facility is a very difficult thing to do because you're intruding on other people's lives. I always feel diffident when I go in, but there's a great officer in charge. She took us through. You go through the TV room, and you move through quite briskly because you're interrupting people watching television, interrupting people using that room. They've got a huge outdoor patio with a big shelter over it, really large space, probably twice the size of this area I'm standing on now. And when you stood on the door, the French windows going out, when you stood there, you could see straight out to the Flinders Ranges, looking beautiful. It was one of those crisp. It was a crisp day. It was July, so not a hot day, but a crisp day. Well, it's hot for me because I'm from Scotland, but it wasn't a hot day. And you could see out the corner of your eyes, you could see how really well kept this whole place was. The grass was well kept. Things were modestly but sensibly planted, and they were well maintained. You could see that somebody cared about the garden. Not in that kind of over-flashy, expensive way, but in the way that somebody who cares about their own home garden cares about it. It's really well looked after. And in the middle of this was a fire with huge burning logs. Burning and smoking logs. And the place was, you just had the smell of the smoke hanging everywhere. And these older men and women, many of them in wheelchairs, many of them not able to do very much or talk very much, were sitting in various positions around the fire. And I asked the officer in charge about this, and she said, well, we got it put in because most of them will have lived most of their lives around fire and around smoke. And shouldn't they have that now when they're here? Shouldn't that be part of the experience? To be out in the open air, but sheltered when needed, and there with the fire and the smoke? And I thought, it's a great answer. It's a great answer because that's actually what public service is about. So this woman didn't think she'd done anything exceptional, genuinely had no concept. For me, it's one of the few times in my life I've had really a spiritual experience in public service setting, because I thought, how much care, how much love, how much attention to real detail that matters, and how modestly the woman wore it. Because it wasn't for her. It was for the people she was working for. And that, in the end, is what it's all about. Thank you.